So unlike what they have told us about the story of poultry and dairy, the fish is very different situation. So first of all, let's think that talking about eggs and talking about poultry is very easy to realize what we're talking about. Is when we're talking about fish, we're talking about fish that can be freshwater species, marine, crustaceans, cephalopods, mollusks, and others. So we're talking a much wider variety. So the fish is a different problem in the sense that it's also consumed by many, many children in Africa and in Asia. So that we have a huge potential to increase nutrition because they are very highly nutritious. They're a high source of high-quality protein, omega-3 fatty acids, and micronutrients such as vitamin A, vitamin B12, iron, calcium, and zinc. What is the problem, though? The problem is that we actually know very little about some of the things that are happening. For instance, how widespread is the fish consumption in Africa? How affordable is the fish? How do the markets work, and particularly the trade? And is there any scope to improve production and consumption? Some of the questions that we still need to answer is, do children actually consume significant amount of fish? Because a lot of the information or data that we have is binary. Do they consume fish or not? And we don't have a lot of information of which type of or which species of fish they're consuming. And because of the wide diversity, the nutritional composition of the species is very different. So again, what type of fish are they consuming? What are the micronutrients or that the children are actually getting? And also, what are the nutritional properties of different species and the preparation methods? So a lot of the fish are dried or are smoked. So are they losing their nutritional properties when they are consumed? So overall, how can Africa better leverage the potential of fish for nutrition? So how do we analyze this problem? We're looking at different data sets. We're using DHS to see child fish consumption patterns. We are using FAO National Food Balance sheets and trade. We're also using the ICP to look at price data on fish. We are doing literature review to look at fish markets in Africa, and also using FAO and Western African sources to look at the different nutrient content of fish. What are some of the major knowledge gaps and data gaps that we have? So first of all, surveys do a poor job of recording the species and the preparation methods, and sometimes we only have binary data if it was consumed or not, and were the actual quantities that it was consumed with. There are very few studies on the value chains and trade studies in Africa, and there's very few individual dietary intake surveys in Africa. And another thing that when we look at the survey data and we compared with the statistics that are presented, sometimes they don't match. So here we're looking at some of the nutrient profile of 35 different fish products, and as we can see, the diversity and of each species, the composition varies across each species. So one of the major takeaways is that it's calorie and protein dense. It's very important for fatty acid. It has calcium has a huge variation in species and preparation. Iron and zinc has a very good amount. Vitamin A, large varieties, but often it's high. And as I was saying, dried fish, eaten in very small quantities, has very small nutrients because it loses a lot of it. So from data that we have seen in DHS data, we have seen that child fish consumption is actually very popular in Africa. So fish is the most common animal source food in 16 out of 27 African DHS countries for children. We can see here that out of 32 countries, actually, 14 have at least 20% or more of their children are consuming fish or consumed fish in the last 24 hours in a recall. So this tells us that there is a huge potential to leverage the consumption that we have to increase nutrition in children in the region. If we look at prices, here we have a different story. We can actually see that fish is often relatively cheap in sub-Saharan Africa, and here we might even be overestimating the prices because there's a lot of direct consumption and trade in informal markets that is not being taken into account in the statistics. If we look at the relationship between wealth and child fish consumption, that varies by country. Here we have a kernel-weighted local polynomial smoothing of predicted recent child fish consumption. And we can see that where fish is common, its consumption will decline with wealth. So we are actually seeing that fish is like a lower good rather than the case where fish consumption and is rare, then it will typically increase with wealth and with income. So in Africa, consumption, since 1961 in both Africa and Asia, consumption has increased, and consumption and supply has increased or doubled. For instance, in West Africa, it has gone from 12 kilocalories per day to 28 kilocalories per day. But in the last 2 decades, actually, while in Southeast Asia, both supply and consumption has gone up by around 34%. In Africa, it has remained flat. And if we look at the share of imports, we can see that Africa depends highly on the import of fish, as Southeastern Asia actually only imports 18%. Something to note here is that actually Africa is importing small fish species, and it is importing high-value fish. Another thing that we need to look at is that formal trade, which is often what we find in statistics, is very important, but so is informal trade. And this is something that is not very well considered, is not being taken into account in a lot of studies. So what are the key takeaways? First of all, there is a need to improve fish supply. There's a huge potential for more trade in fresh fish, in trade facilitation, and to reduce informality. And there's significant potential for growth in Africa, aquaculture. There's, to improve fish demand, we need to combat perception of fish as an inferior good. And research needs, there's improvement, measurement in surveys, national accounts, price surveys, and we know very little about kids, and assess contribution of diets and nutrition outcomes, and to improve evidence base for nutrition-sensitive fish development strategies. So I'm gonna turn it over to David Stoffel.